If you ask me, the world's oldest profession is actually the infantry. They're the foot soldiers who ultimately decide the fate of each battle. Once every couple of hundred years, the infantry changes the game completely by imagining a new strategy to destroy the enemy. Afterwards, the world map usually looks very different. This pattern repeats itself throughout history. These major shifts in tactics and weapons launched us from the Roman soldier with his sword and shield to the modern day infantryman carrying an M4 and ballistic body armor. Let's learn about how the infantry has evolved, covering how they fight to why they fight. One of my favorite quotes on the infantry is from the famous war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who said, "I love the infantry because they are the underdogs. They are the mud, rain, frost, and wind boys. They have no comfort, and they even learn to live without necessities. And in the end, they are the guys that wars cannot be won without." You might be surprised to know only 15% of the entire army is made up of the infantry. It takes 5 logistics people to support every one combat role. Wait. If only 15% of the entire army is infantry, what's the other 85%? That's everybody that scored high enough on their entrance exam to do something else. Oh, so what'd you do? Infantry. The actual meaning of the word comes from the word infant, meaning youth or immature. This was originally a reference to everyone who was too young to join the cavalry at that time. The cavalry was considered a more mature and coveted role than being doomed to the line infantry. I can already hear all you Cav Scouts out there laughing for being more mature than the infantry. You guys haven't had horses for hundreds of years, but you still wear cowboy hats and spurs. You're not fooling anyone. The term line infantry comes from when foot soldiers lined up in closed ranks. Those guys were either brave as heck, insane, or forced into that position. They were elbow to elbow in columns and rows like some kind of nightmare Excel spreadsheet armed with rifles. Whether you had a sword or a musket, you showed up on the field of battle in pretty much the same formation from 400 BC to 1915 AD. Troops used this formation so they could hold the integrity of the line. If the enemy broke through your line, it was pretty much over. The Greek Phalanx is an amazing example of one of the first major evolutions in infantry tactics to change the world. They used the 20-foot long spear called a sarissa throughout their entire formation to stop charges. If you got past their first rank, the second rank and third rank were there to stop you. They used the new weapon and tactic to essentially unite the entire Greek Empire. And there's this misconception that armies, especially during like the American Civil War, lined up to be gentlemen about war. No. They lined up in those formations out of necessity. It might look dumb today, but back then it was their best strategy that they had. This rank and line formation allowed infantrymen to repel cavalry charges. And even once muskets hit the scene, their short effective range and slow reload speed meant that if they were spread out, they would have been surrounded and easily beaten. If you're sitting there thinking lining up and charging at each other sounds like a raw deal, you're not alone. That noise. Everyone else was thinking this too, so armies were forced into service. Most infantrymen from the Napoleonic Wars onward were citizen soldiers. They fought when they were called on. It was part of your civic duty, like being called in for jury duty that lasted 3 years and you had a 20% chance of coming home from. The modern Western military is entirely volunteer, so it's an alien concept to us now. And this evolution took place over time as a consequence of advances in technology. The modern military wouldn't want to reinstate the draft again today because they wouldn't be able to find enough qualified people to fill the ranks. Anytime you hear about a draft being reinstated, you can breathe easier knowing most people's incompetence matched with the complexities of modern warfare will prevent it from ever happening again, with the exception of World War III, but I hear that'll be over quick. While conscription has gone out of style, you can learn a lot by looking at what has endured to stay with the infantry over the ages. Like the standard, which is still used by soldiers today, although for a very different purpose. The earliest foot soldiers used symbols on top of a large pole called a standard, or war flag. Often the symbol would be of an animal. For the Romans, it was an eagle, but you can imagine your own personal standard with your own favorite animal at top. Never mind, go back. A soldier would loudly sound a trumpet in the middle of battle to get everybody's attention, and then they would wave the standard in a predetermined way to signal the entire army to change formation and strategy. The war flag let everyone know where their regiment and commander was. This seems ridiculous to us today. We do everything we can to hide our position and not let the enemy know the location of our commander. I'm looking at you, guy who always salutes the lieutenant out on patrol, you blue falcon. The best story of an aquafire carrying the standard comes from 55 BC when Julius Caesar Caesar invaded Britain by sea. The aquafire jumped into the water, waded ashore, carrying the standard high above him. He turned around, noticed his buddies were too afraid to join him. He shouted, "Leap, fellow soldiers, unless you wish to betray your eagle to the enemy. I, for my part, will perform my duty to the Republic and my general." I'm not sure why I gave him an accent. The last credible rumor of a time when the US military lost their standard was the 7th Cavalry at Custer's last stand. Who's more mature now, Cav Scouts? Maybe hold on to your battle flag. A lot of people today see these old traditions as antiquated and boring. To be fair, they can be annoying. I've stood at attention in formation for hours, not moving, until getting chewed out just for itching my nose. Fine, I was picking it. All of the marching, trumpeting, and flag waving has a purpose of teaching the individual infantryman to act as one unit. It's meant to build confidence in your teammates. It's basically a team building exercise your boss makes you do after work at that new escape room they opened down at the mall. After the Roman Empire fell, there is a common misconception that there was no medieval tactics at all. This is wrong. In the year 1302, at the Battle of Cortari, the Flemish army knew that they were outnumbered by a larger, better armored French force of 5,000 cavalry. They were up against knights with expensive armor and weapons. The Flemish used their smarts. They chose their battleground wisely. They lined up at a river with the river to their back, and they dug a ton of pits between them and the enemy. When the French came to attack them in the fog, they fell into these trap pits and were cut apart where they lay. Not exactly how modern day American Army infantry would fight. We only engage in a 3-to-1 odds in our favor. What's that you got there, a fair fight? No thanks. After the Middle Ages, the next turning point was gunpowder. Firearms were used by the early 1600s. And by 1760, rifles were in use, but only by a few specialists. These early firearms were 4 feet 11 inches long and weighed 10 pounds. They fired a massive 75 caliber bullet, and the effective range was 125 yards. It misfired 1 in every 6 rounds, and it took 3 minutes to load. I'm gonna get you. You wait, I'm almost, if I can just, can you hold this? Yeah, I'm gonna be right there. New technologies alone, like the rifle, rarely gave a battlefield advantage unless they were combined with a new concept of how to use them. In the 1700s, society still operated on an aristocratic hierarchy, so the nobility had the power. The infantry units reflected the way society functioned. The top nobles dominated the high-ranking 4-star general positions. The lesser nobles filled in the company commander roles, not necessarily the most competent dudes for the job who led you into battle. Our modern notion of what's right and wrong goes directly in the face of this. In the mind of the American modern-day military, we like to think of ourselves as a meritorious group. The best people fill the top roles because of their personal, professional achievements. Your commander could have the worst physical fitness test and rifle scores. It didn't matter. They were going to be telling you where to go and what to do. Because of this, you had a situation where there were too many officers. It was often 1 officer for every 11 men. Go charge the enemy, peasant! No way, I'm good. I'm gonna stay right here. Gods, have this man executed. Bummer. Being an infantryman in the 1700s and being led by a bunch of inbred nobles meant troops suffered from low morale. Desertion rates were high, with the French estimating they lost 70,000 men who just said yeet and ran off into the woods, never to be heard from again. Except if they were caught, at which point they'd be tied to a wooden horse as punishment. And then they would also tie muskets to their feet. Weird punishments. Right after the French Revolution in 1790, a bunch of heads rolled and the practice of venality ended. This meant people could no longer buy their rank, they had to earn it instead. I know, earning stuff sucks. All citizens were then eligible for officer selection. Notice how we're seeing the social changes and culture of the time affect the way infantry units fought. Changes in culture can be almost as revolutionary as technological changes. In the 1900s, there were insanely fast advances in military technology, like the Maxim machine gun, which was capable of firing 600 rounds per minute from a 250-round belt. In the Matabele War, 700 British soldiers armed with 5 of these Maxim machine guns fought off 5,000 warriors. This is an insane advantage. It must have felt like fighting against an enemy from the future with alien technology. It helped them colonize Africa, like how the Greek Phalanx helped Alexander the Great conquer all of Greece. By World War I, the machine gun technology had become commonplace to their European competitors. At the Battle of Somme, Britain lost some 20,000 men in a single day to the German machine guns. And they say once you get a weapon, your enemy will have it within like 10 years. This change meant tactics and drills had to be adjusted. Small units needed to be more flexible, and the kind of individual personal initiative that would have made generals in the 1700s red in the face because they never would have trusted their lower enlisted with that much power. During this time, more responsibility was given to junior officers and lower enlisted men, reluctantly and out of necessity. Infantrymen had to learn for the first time how to advance in open order and use aimed fire. This meant their job just got a heck of a lot more difficult. Soldiers had to take it on faith that 10 meters down the formation line, your buddies still had your back, even though you couldn't physically see them. You had to spread out more because one artillery round or grenade could take everyone out if they were bunched up close together. Charles Dupac was an interesting French military theorist in the 1800s, and he pointed out the problem with modern warfare with incredible accuracy. He said the infantry could no longer trust their training on the battlefield. In the past, with swords and muskets, you didn't need to trust where your allies were. You knew it. You could literally see it. In old formations, you could feel that your battle buddy was there or not. I know, I'm gonna get killed in the comment section for saying battle buddy. The battle buddy system was used today as a major purpose in infantry doctrine. The system is there so you're watching each other and making sure you're both doing your jobs. It's like a check and balance. So in modern war, the formations move further apart. We go from close proximity column and rank formations that we've seen for millennia to new formations. The staggered column, wedge formation, and the diamond appear. And these formations that could have gotten you broken off and separated, destroyed if you used them 200 years ago, it's like all of a sudden someone changes all the rules to a chess game in the middle of a 2,000-year-old match. Now we're using new formations that never would have been used before. Before World War I, the smallest infantry element was 100 men. It's a company-sized element. The French were the first to recognize the need for platoon tactics in 1916 after they got their asses handed to them. The Germans and Americans followed suit in 1917. This was a huge moment in the history of modern infantry tactics. For the next 100 years, all the way to today, the platoon still represents the smallest combat group. An extremely effective infantry tactic that developed right side along conventional tactics is guerrilla warfare. Military strategist Sun Tzu was one of the first to outline how to fight a guerrilla war. This type of tactic was commonly used by all of the tribes that faced off against Rome. The United States, with all of our technology and well-trained military, still has problems putting down insurgencies in multiple countries. And this is because of how effective this tactic is. Guerrilla warfare is usually the infantry's best option when facing a larger army. It's the only way to get the advantage. The main strategy is to avoid attacking the larger force head-on. Instead, the guerrillas employ traps like spike pits or roadside bombs and attack soft targets like the supply lines. The term comes from the Peninsular War in 1808, fought against the Spanish. The Spanish word for war is guerra, so the Spanish irregulars were called guerrillas. Now we need to talk about the Marshall effect, and it's one of the most controversial takes on the study of infantrymen. Brigadier General Marshall was one of those officers who studied battles to find insights that sometimes can lead to having that one advantage necessary to defeat the enemy. He embedded with units from World War I to Vietnam, and from his observation, he came up with a controversial theory. He presented the theory to the top generals of the time because he wanted to fix a problem he noticed with the infantry. What he found, however, was definitely not what they wanted him to come back with. It became a huge case of shoot the messenger. Marshall noted that conscripted soldiers often, he believed, didn't fire their weapon when in combat. He concluded 1 in 4 soldiers would shoot while the rest hid. No one wanted to hear that kind of crap, but there was an exception to the rule. The machine gun teams fired their weapons more frequently. And why was that? It was a mystery to Marshall at first, and then he came up with the idea that the reason heavy weapons returned fire more often was because they were part of a 2-man team that depended on each other. Crew-served weapons are maintained and fired based on teamwork. The Maxim machine gun in 1890 needed a crew of 4 to work effectively. Today, for an M240 Bravo, it's ideal to have a team of 2, the gunner and assistant gunner, both working together to keep the heavy weapon going. Barrel changes, feeding ammo, loading ammo, carrying ammo, spotting targets. they're depending on each other, hence the modern day battle buddy doctrine. Okay, fine, I won't say it again. These teams don't want to let each other down out there. They're in close proximity the way war had been fought for all time. Marshall concluded that this was why they were more effective. Was Marshall maybe finding out that this was just a part of human nature? Maybe people evolved to always be better when they're fighting directly next to a comrade? Or was it way less deep and Marshall was just a pencil-pushing, annoying military historian with his own political agenda? I'll leave it up to you to decide. Either way you choose to believe, we shouldn't underestimate how much of an impact moving further apart had on the infantrymen. War became a more distant, lonely, and terrifying place than ever before. This called for more trust and communication. They needed a better trained infantry, and like Dupac had pointed out, I'm sure I butchered his name, training had become terrible. Today we have battle drills meant to replicate exactly what to do in various combat situations. The drill changes depending on if you're taking fire as a squad-sized element or you're in a platoon movement. The drill changes if the contact is close ambush or far away, past grenade throwing range. Advances in technology have been able to create a greater level of faith in the modern soldier's confidence that they'll know exactly what to do when the first shot rings out. Each infantryman in a drill needs to know what their role is during and given any part of that drill. The M240 Bravo automatic machine gun is going to have to provide a base of fire. Their job is to gain fire superiority over the enemy. The M4 rifleman has a very different role. They'll try to outmaneuver and outflank the enemy position. They need to know not only their own job, but each other's job as well. You can see why the modern infantryman's job is way more difficult than it might appear. Not only does training need to be perfected, but the soldier's purpose needs to be strong as well, or they will lose, as this quote illustrates. Once the mass of the defending infantry become possessed or low morale, the battle is as good as lost. Douglas Haig, 1st Earl of Haig, sweet title. How has the reason for why we fight evolved? The infantry over time moved away from fighting for their religion as a force for morale. Cultural changes over the years have influenced our motivation for war. The infantrymen of today fight for each other and for their belief in their country's values. This is where a new concept begins to creep in that we hadn't really seen in ages, and it will rule how the modern infantry sees their purpose. It's a concept revived from the ancient Spartan society called military professionalism. Professionalism in the military is the sense of pride in competence and skills as a soldier. The Vietnam War was just as unpopular back home as the war in Iraq, and yet morale didn't fall apart for the US Army or Marines in Iraq. This could be because, unlike in Vietnam, we place a high level of importance on the soldier's sense of professional pride. Troops train together for months leading up to a deployment and go through their entire tour as the same team they've been training with instead of some seemingly random rotation of people. There hasn't been another major shift in infantry tactics since World War I, really. Platoons are still 40 soldiers split into 4 squads of 9 and then 2 fire teams, and specialists like grenadiers are spread out. Since it's been so long since a tactical shift, the military is starting to get anxious. They believe another major change in warfare is right on the horizon. The US military has every reason to keep tactics the same since it's going relatively well for them. And they have less reason for their enemies to imagine what the next Greek phalanx might be. Today in the infantry is taught a warrior creed that was created in the 1990s. It's a big feature of the infantry doctrine, and the abbreviated version goes like this, quote, "I'm a warrior and a member of the team. I serve the people of the United States and live the Army values. I will always place the mission first. I will never quit. I will never leave a comrade. I'm an expert and a professional." I know hearing that makes a lot of you cringe. Yes, it's corny. Did you seriously just read the warrior creed out loud without somebody threatening you with push-ups? It's part of military doctrine. There was no way around it. You were the weird guy in the platoon that everyone made fun of, weren't you? People criticize it for being brainwashy. It's like taking 2 extra moto pills in the morning. But it dictates a lot of the behavior in the modern day infantryman, so it's important to understand. The Warrior's Creed is seen by many as a quasi-religious, nationalistic combination to give the modern infantryman something to fight for if they have nothing that they believe in, especially if they're given a mission with a purpose that seems unclear. Tremendous resources, money, and lives are poured into making sure a fallen or lost soldier is never left behind. This was evident with the retrieval of the Special Forces soldiers who were killed in Niger in 2017, and the Bowie Bagdal case where an infantryman wandered off post in Afghanistan and was captured by the enemy. These changes hint at the next major shift in warfare. which, if it's anything like past shifts, threatens to reshape country lines and culture as we know it. It will likely change from the current trend of fighting as a few networks of expensive platforms like aircraft carriers and expensive tanks to, in the future, possibly fighting as a swarm of many low-cost assets. Check out part 2 of this series where we'll be covering the mysterious future of the infantry. Remember to like and subscribe to our videos to support the channel. Thank you.